The final objection I want to talk about utilitarianism kind of builds, or actually really builds on this idea that it's very hard to know what the consequences are, especially for big actions. And the objection is this, that utilitarianism can be used to justify any course of action, no matter how horrible or selfish. We don't exactly know what the probabilities are or what the consequences are, but you can plug in some probabilities for some great or horrible outcome that justify whatever you want to do. Now, I'm not quite sure in this pure form if this is true, but I think utilitarianism can and has been used to justify some pretty bad stuff. Probably the biggest example, and people often forget about this, but Elizabeth Anderson, a philosopher that I quite like, documents this in pretty horrible detail in a recent book she wrote called Hijacked, is Bentham's national charity company. Bentham, not having you guys read him, he's a little bit of a boring writer, but Bentham was kind of the father of utilitarianism, the first really prominent person to give an exact statement of the theory, at least in the Western tradition. There's some evidence that there was a moral school in China, the Moists, who seemed like they were probably utilitarians, but there's some debate about that. Anyway, Bentham was the grandfather of utilitarianism. Bentham also had, and justified in this utilitarian terms, a series of basically prisons in England for poor people. He called it the National Charity Company, and the basic idea was every person in England who was a beggar, or even if husbands thought their wives weren't pulling their weight, or their children, they could throw them in these work camps. A company would run it, and they would work these people as hard as possible for profit. And Bentham basically justified this in utilitarian terms. Poor people are lazy, he thought. We need to make them work. That'll have the best consequences for everybody. So, National Charity Company. I mean, not all utilitarians have thought this. J.S. Mill, who we'll talk about in a second, actually had really different things to say about poverty. But I'm not sure that that solves the problem, right? If you're Jeremy Bentham and you have these strong biases against the poorer people in England, you can twist your utilitarian reasoning to justify it. And he did. Or, in the article we've read, and this guy has been in the background the whole time, but let's bring him out, Sam Bankman-Fried, right? McCaskill, there's some pretty good evidence that he was warned that Fried was dishonest, that Fried was doing some stuff that was not above board, and turned a blind eye to it. And you can kind of see how you could justify this in utilitarian terms. Yeah, Fried might not be above board, but look at all the money he's giving for our great utilitarian causes and all the happiness that creates. Or some other examples, right? Think of the effective altruists and how they've gotten away from helping people in poorer countries and are basically trying to recruit more effective altruists, sometimes in pretty palatial settings. They actually bought an unused British castle because they say, well, we spend a lot of money on this, but this will help us recruit more effective altruists who will give us more money, and in the long term, that will create better consequences. Emil Torres, this guy who used to be an effective altruist, a utilitarian, and later left the movement, he actually dug up some evidence that McCaskill was paying a publicity company, a publicist, $12,000 a month to promote his book. And again, you can see how that you could justify this in utilitarian terms. Well, if my book gets out there, more people will read it. And, what if more people read it? More people will become effective altruists. They'll give more money. That'll have great consequences in the long term, and so on and so forth. Or think about the claim that, some of the other effective altruists said that McCaskill might lie to you. I don't know if he's lying or not, but again, that would be justified in utilitarian terms. If you need to lie to a journalist to keep the money flowing to do, you say, good things, you would do it, right? And look, I'm not saying that McCaskill or any other effective altruist, any other utilitarian is trying to con people. I don't know. I don't think that they probably are. I think they probably believe this themselves. But notice in the utilitarian framework how easy it would be to talk yourself into believing that the thing that benefits you is also the thing that will create the most overall happiness. Now look, J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, another utilitarian I haven't really had you guys read, for various reasons you can't read everything you want. Mill's response to this is any moral theory can be misused to justify awful things. Think about Christianity. I'm religious myself, but I think Mill's right. He says, well, look, Christianity says love your neighbor as yourself, and somehow they twisted this into let's burn people who mouth off about the church and things that we don't like at the stake, right? If you can somehow get from love your neighbor as yourself to let's burn the heretic, that's pretty good evidence that any moral theory can be misused, and misused in pretty terrible ways. And Mill would say, look, if that's true, what's so dangerous about utilitarianism? And I think Mill would have a few other responses. I think Mill would say, because we're so prone to get things wrong, especially in self-interested ways, when we try to figure the utilities all the time, we just generally shouldn't do that. Generally, we should just follow the moral rules. Mill would say we should only really calculate utilities in emergency situations because we're so prone to getting it wrong. So I think there's more defensible forms of utilitarianism than you might see with the effective altruist, that you might see with that crowd. And one way that might make it more defensible is just to not always try to go around figuring the odds. Just think about, that's probably a route to making utilitarianism sillier than it needs to be. But I want to say to Mill, might not utilitarianism be especially open to this kind of misuse? And now look, I'm going to bring up another fact, and I'm not just trying to embarrass utilitarians with a long list of utilitarians behaving badly, because I do think that a lot of them are sincere people who mean well. But if a sincere person who means well, which I think John Stuart Mill and probably William McCaskill are, can be misled by the theory, that's really worrying. And so how was Mill misled by the theory? Mill actually worked for the British East India Company. The British East India Company was a company that over time conquered India and ruthlessly exploited it. They did some horrible stuff. There was a rebellion in the 1850s, and by any definition of the term, the British East India Company committed war crimes putting it down. Not only did Mill work for the British East India Company his whole life, he actually wrote a defense of the British East India Company even in light of the war crimes it committed. Including when the emperor's son surrendered, they just murdered him, right? And Mill's like, well, did some bad things, but in Mill's terms, he thought, well, the Indians aren't civilized, and we British, yes, we don't always live up to our principles, but we are civilizing them. And yes, there might be some unpleasantness in the short term, but in the long term, it will be better for everyone. Now, I think Mill was just wrong. But that he could talk himself into believing this in utilitarian terms is scary. It's even scarier if you think, as I do, that John Stuart Mill was not a bad person. He was not a con man like someone like Freud or a scoundrel just using the theory. I think he was trying to be sincere. And we'll talk about this when we get to Kantianism. Mill was actually very, very forward thinking on race for his day. And Immanuel Kant, who we'll talk about in a few weeks, actually wrote some things that by any standard are racist. But it's weird because Mill, the utilitarian, was just fine with European colonialism because he thought the consequences would justify it. Kant, who is arguably as a person shows more signs of racism than Mill, was very categorically against colonialism. And I think he was against colonialism in a way that Mill, who you might have expected to do better on this, wasn't, because Kant's moral theory, in a way that utilitarianism doesn't, said that colonialism was wrong. We will talk about how and why that is, but I do think, and I'm not just, not just saying, oh, here's utilitarians doing bad stuff, bad theory. I think, though, that if you look, and people who use this theory to try to, and they're trying to behave sincerely well, if they're led astray by it, or it leads them to give into their worst impulses, as it often does, that is something to worry about. In the same vein, in response to Mill, you might say that any power tool can injure somebody, but, if you have this horrible buzzsaw that my dad used to have that doesn't even have a guard on it, that's a lot more likely than a modern one that has a guard on it, even more likely than one of those ones that will automatically stop the second they hit a human finger or whatever, right? So yeah, any moral theory can be abused. Might not utilitarianism be especially open to this? Now look, I'm being very hard on utilitarianism. I do think utilitarianism gets at some important truths. I think that consequences are important. They're a natural way to think about the morality of our actions. I don't think that utilitarianism is going to be the whole truth about ethics. Anyway, but hopefully, even though I've been very hard on the theory, especially in these last few lectures, I hope I've presented it fairly because I do think it has some important insights.